because I've gotten here by just pure grunt work. Like, sure, oh, how do you do this? Well, if you go on a plane and you travel around the world for 3 years and you live out of a suitcase and you trash every relationship you've ever had and you just say yes to every opportunity, you'll be able to do this. So I was like, yeah, great, done that. Now it's like, okay, how do I get to the next level? It's like, well, now you need to slow down. You're like, I don't know what that means. So it is difficult to have the discipline now from like a lifestyle perspective to overcome this plateau. I need to express the discipline enough to remove myself from that attitude of like, just keep your head down, don't blink, take a bunch of drugs, and then just work until you can't work anymore, then work some more. So that's something that's frankly taken more wrestling with mentally than anything else I've ever done, because of you're telling me to not do something.
I saw something on your Insta that I really thought was interesting. Have you tried trying? What's that mean?
It means, especially where I operate very much in an academic space, and there's a large push into optimization. And I think a lot of times what we miss is intentionality, and we just actually miss the follow through and the execution and actually just trying. So a lot of people are just becoming a repository of useless information just to prove that they're smart on the internet. But that's not why I got into this. I got into it to get stronger, and everything I've learned was just to break a certain plateau. And really, at the end of the day, I think what separates people who do things and who do things well is how they actually do things. So people who try when they do shit tend to, just by a consequence of trying, do shit better.
That highlights something I've been thinking about a lot, which is the bridging the gap between insight and execution being where almost all of the gains are to be found.
Yeah, because I mean, I work decently close with professional bodybuilders, and you could fill a very large room with things they do poorly or incorrectly, but the one catalyst that seems to set them apart in their sport is that they will just, regardless of if running through walls is the way to do it, they'll do it more and harder than anyone else. So it's like, it almost creates, not that the intellectual pursuit is a moot point, but it's, if at the end of the day, are you trying to be big? Are you trying to be fast? Are you trying to be lean? Or are you trying to be smart? Because, rarely do those things coexist. Not that they can't, and when they can, we can reach something akin to optimization. But unless you have that execution, that veracity in the way you execute, then you're really just collecting IQ points for no reason. I'd rather add 2 inches to my arm than 10 points to my IQ.
That's spoken like a true powerlifter. Yeah, we have a buddy who's often on the show, Youssef, and he speaks about a period while he was a med student where he said he uselessly indexed information for the ruthless hell of it. And I think that mental masturbation and the sort of cerebral game that a lot of people can play, it does lead to inaction. Certainly 2020, it's been the year of people ruminating, right?
And it can cripple you too, right? Like the negative effects of your own intellect, like falling in love with your own creation, right? I think is a lot of times leaving people to just be this giant one-dimensional intellect. And if I don't know how deep into that the religious or philosophical psychosocial rabbit hole you want to go, but like that was one of the breakdowns of religion in Western society. That was what kind of led to the proclamation of God being dead, was the fact that it fell in love with its own creation, right? And I feel a lot of people, albeit maybe not as profound a result of that, but lead them to that sort of crippling inaction because they do fall in love with their own creation. With the more they know, it's just like, it's not why I got into this.
I wonder whether that's a byproduct of the convenience of the 21st century. Like, no one's making shit with their hands anymore. Like, when I need a room in my house decorating, I ring a decorator. I don't go and do it myself because I can find a Deliveroo, a Michelin star meal while you're watching Netflix documentary and Amazon Prime the TV to your house. Like this hyper convenience. I wonder whether that's forcing people to not put skin in the game with things that they previously might have done.
Yeah, I just think there's a new landscape in which we're competing on now, right? Like the plumbers, I never picked a plumber based off of Instagram, right? But people are picking coaches and people are picking educators and people are picking, anything to do in the supplements or products or whatever in the fitness space based off of, the trading of social capital, right? So I really think that there is, like you kind of said, a removal of that skin in the game. and you don't necessarily have to be competitive at the execution. You just have to be competitive in this simulation, right? So you check the boxes that, so you write a smart post and you get feedback, positive reinforcement, like, oh, I picked up 3 new clients because I used a bunch of big words. But it's like, okay, are you trying to acquire clients or are you trying to retain clients? If you can't actually, follow through on that, and you can't execute, and you don't know whether or not your principles actually work, then it's like you're constantly going to be in, from a business standpoint, in this phase of acquisition, where that just leads you down this rabbit hole of creating this repository. And I love the word ruthless, like that repository, that ruthless pursuit of creating this repository of like useless information. Right. So it's just, I think social media is large in part to do with that accumulation, that hoarding of information. It's like I know something you don't know. Essentially creates like a flat earthers of fitness, that just like everyone's trying to come up with their own shtick just to be different. Right. It's just to prove that they can survive, and if you want to survive, you got to train with me, sort of thing. So it's it's a very interesting business in the fitness exclusive. I don't think real estate succumbs to that same issue. I don't know if high finance, like I don't know how many followers Warren Buffett has on Instagram, but I guarantee you there's some fitness chick out there with a promo code that has more.
How do you compete then in this marketplace? The complaint that we have here is that people win at this game who don't have the virtue to win, that they're all show and no grow, that the results don't actually speak for themselves. It's just that they're fantastic marketers. But if you're a guy out there who is an unbelievable PT or a fantastic plumber or whatever it is, surely you still need to play the game. You got to do the Instagram thing, use the hashtags, put the good content up with that lovely depth of field effect in the background.
Look at us go. I think it's the nice part about the game is you get to define what winning is. So you get to define your lines in the sand, right? It's not predetermined for you. There are things that work in various speeds, I would say. Like, if I wanted to sell my soul to the devil, I would know exactly how I would do it, right? There'd be, some sort of diet that would shred me down to 6%. There'd be a bunch of pictures taken with me without my shirt on, and then the whole depth of field thing and all that. But, following is, I think, how people think the game is won, right? Like building followings or subscribers or downloads or whatever. But to me, it's a business. Like it's won and lost. It's a won and lost at the bottom line. So I know people who have smaller followings that convert well, that sell great products and retain great. That they don't have a swipe up on their Instagram account, but the way I measure winning in dollars and cents is like they got some digits in the bank account that they won, right? So I think it is understanding that, look, if you are trying to utilize social media from a business gain, understand what winning in business really means, right? Because it's not the be all end all metric and in the indicator to which you are going to earn money, right? So I think a lot of people get caught chasing the wrong things, and then if they do acquire a massive following by whatever means necessary, they're in a position where likely they're not really apt to monetize, and then they're left scrambling to try and build systems. It's like a following will come if you put out value, and you will be able to work more efficiently if you define winning by sort of that bottom line. So it's something that you get a little serotonin dump every now and then, and you get a new follower, a like or whatever. But if you can start to get those serotonin dumps when you get deposits into your bank account, I think that should be more of your focus. And if you geared your decisions more off of that, and obviously like you have to have a moral guideline, which like you don't cross certain lines. But I think if that's, being a consumer or creator, if you're on the creative side of social media, I think starting from a business standpoint will actually allow you to define those ethical and moral lines a little bit more clearly, because you won't have to make desperate moves based purely off of just acquiring that bottom line.
I think people see through it as well. We all know that person on Instagram who will do anything for another video to bang. And even if they're winning at the game of Instagram, they're being laughed at by all of the people who might even watch the video. There's like I'm sure you'll have them as well. I've done quite efficiently this year at removing the slow motion car crash accounts from my account that I was obsessed with watching, because there's something so compelling about watching someone just wade through hypocrisy day after day after day. But You don't know if the success that that person has is because everybody else is doing the same thing. I can't believe that this person is just living such a like vapid, like completely shallow life. But from the outside, it might look like they're winning.
And I think the real concern there is not only at a certain point do other people in the industry start to see through it, and to a certain degree that'll bleed into the general public or the consumer. But my biggest concern in being around this for however many years I've been around this for is when you start to see through it, where you as a perpetrator of this dissonant character on the internet versus real life. I've seen people literally lose their minds, like hospitalized, anxiety attacks, panic attacks, because there's dissonant characters, right? There is the simulation online, there's the avatar of themselves, and then there's the person on like to which that exists on the other 22 hours a day where they're not on their phone, or 20 or 18 or 16 or 2 hours they're not on their phone, depending on who it is. And it's like, that's the biggest concern to me. It's like, yeah, it's one thing for other people to see through it, but it'll always get to a point where doing it for the gram is your life and livelihood. And if there's a dissonance between who you are on the internet and who you are in real life, the more that wedge begins to divide, the more trouble you're actually going to be in. So that for me, like, I was lucky enough in a certain sense to be exposed to people who lived that dissonance, and lived is a word I use kind of loosely in that case, because it really was kind of driving a wedge through their psyche, because they do have these dual personalities. Like people who maybe a little bit more introverted in the way they would operate in the day to day, that the second the story was on, they were like, yeah, may swipe up. Then the next thing you know, they go reclusive, and it's every time they go reclusive, they feel the need to go more extravagant when the record button is on, and that spirals them back to this refractory further inclusivity. And then all of a sudden they're just, schizophrenic, bipolar, person's multiple or split personality disorder. And it's social media is, I think, large to blame how we reward people who do have these car crash accounts with keeping them on the needle of the likes and the follows and the subscribes and the shares. That only rewards that behavior and further creates the distance between the avatar that exists on the internet and the person that exists in real life, until at some point that bend just breaks.
How do you avoid tumbling into that hole yourself?
Never post anything that isn't true in real life.
What's that mean?
Don't do anything just for Instagram. Like, everything from like, I'm not going to go off program to hit a PR on a lift for Instagram, because that's how it starts, right? Like, whether that's friendships, whether that's relationships. I know couples that only post as a means of saying sorry for some sort of argument that's existing in real life. I know a buddy of mine, I'm not going to name his name, but every time he posts a picture of him and his girl, I know he's sleeping on the fucking couch. 100%. 1000%. Like, I know, like, that is the relationship exists on social media. And I know every time that card gets played, it's like, oh shit. Like, I'm not going to name names, but buddy posted a picture of him and his girl. Everyone's like, oh, it's adorable. It's like, oh man, I got it. Hey, bro, you need a place to sleep? You need a place to stay tonight? So it's like, whatever the situation is, it just has to be a transparency. And I'm not saying like go on there, and this is one thing I can't stand, like, we all got problems, right? Don't use, like, talking about psychological problems on social media is like talking about your drinking problem at the bar. It's like you're kind of missing the point here. This is the exact reason. So it's like there has to be a certain level of transparency, but also a certain level of privacy. There needs to be things you do for yourself that aren't on social media but there are lines that you draw that, okay, now this is where my private life ends. It's still a continuation of me, and this is what I can put on the internet. Right. So I think there has to be kind of a two-way street of like, okay, I don't want to create dissonance by doing things specifically for the internet, but I also don't want to have the internet be a full-on voyeuristic view of me as an entire person.
That makes sense. I push back a little bit, I think, about the psychological issues. If you're doing it for the reason that I know that this is going to get sympathy likes, then yeah, certainly not. On the flip side of that, I do think that it's important for people who are in positions that have large followings to show that they're not as bulletproof as their Instagram may lead people to believe. It is by its very essence a highlight reel of everybody's lives. And I think, yeah, you can weaponize polar opposite of that and use it for a nefarious reason, which is I know if I post me with a tear running down my face or a really long caption that talks about how I was suicidal last night, like that may be too far. But certainly reflectively talking about having a bad year, coming up against issues, like that nuance, I think is really, really important. It's something that I enjoy doing myself, and it's a competitive advantage because I'm prepared to look at the ugly bits of my life and then talk about them, mostly on the show rather than in an Instagram caption. But I do think it's important.
And that's a caveat, right? Like, I think talk about them. The medium is the message, right? Like, I have hour-long podcasts that, like, and it is because it is a conversation, like from ex-wives to ex-girlfriends. Like, I've gone on my friends' podcasts, and my podcast is whatever. But like, I have friends who have podcasts that are hundreds of thousands of millions of downloads a year. And like, I've discussed, because they're all my friends, and it's on the internet, whatever. So I definitely agree to a certain extent that, there is that unfiltered, unpolished look. We all got problems. I am someone who's on the other side, or creator on Instagram or whatever, but I don't think Instagram is the place, because Instagram is not a place for dialogue and conversation, right? So like, I've gone candid and talked about things, and I've received text messages on the back end, but it's things that I would say to anyone's face, but on podcasts. And that's what I like podcasts, creating this repository of conversation, because it is dialogue. Because we couldn't, how many posts we would have to go back and forth on.
An entire year
conversation, right? I tag you like, oh, I don't think people should talk about whatever. Like, well, I was talking about podcasts, right? So I think exactly, that would be a great YouTube series. We just go back and forth at each other and just have some YouTube constructed.
I've seen some really good stuff from Rationality Rules, a guy called Stephen Woodford over here is a YouTuber, philosophy YouTuber, and him and a Christian philosopher went back and forth about a particular argument for the existence of God, and they did like a debate would be, but they uploaded the opening statement from one, then the opening statement from the other, then the first rebuttal, then the second rebuttal, and they just made it into a little series, and it was on each other's channel. And it actually ended up being, like, philosophy of religion's not something that I would spend all day watching, but the concept I thought was relatively interesting.
Yeah, but see, to me, it's, if we're especially in a debate setting, it has to be instantaneous. Right, because I can't, like, my hands are up here. Everything I'm talking about, I'm pulling from my own my own working memory.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting platform, but it's like, to me, there's nothing realer than this. There's nothing we've evolved more in sync with than this interaction. So any latency creates a level of disingenuousness or a lack of congruency, like a lack of truth to it. So for me, like, you got to be able to bring it in this setting. You got to be able to, like, go mono and have this conversation. Like, well, I disagree. Oh, okay. Well, Instagram versus social, or Instagram versus podcast. Great. Sorted. Right. Yeah. Where it's like,
it's the same, I suppose, as sparring in the cage or throwing combinations on the bag next to each other.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've never once paid for a pay-per-view of someone just hitting the speed bag.
That's a good point. Yeah, man. One thing I was thinking earlier on, there's this example, I think it's analog to the Malthusian trap, which is where you get population overgrowth. And it was me thinking about people that perhaps play the game on social media to an extreme, being out competing those who don't. And that's what have you done? Have you dropped something?
I'm looking for the charger for my computer, but do continue. All these cords.
Technological nightmare today. So you can imagine this experiment where you've got a ton of rats living on an island. Let's say there's 1,000 of them. Over time, these rats develop culture and politics and art and dance and all of this beautiful stuff, music. And what the rats find out is that as the population approaches pretty much the top-end capacity, it starts to level out because there's less and less resources. You could see this as higher competition within a market for clients or for likes or for content or for eyes. As it approaches that, some of the rats actually realize, hang on, if I don't do that dance and art and music bullshit, I can spend more time foraging for food and trying to reproduce. So the rats who do the stuff, the more virtuous stuff, that adds flavor and content to the world, actually get outcompeted by the ones who just go for the lowest common denominator. And what you see over time is that all of the rats that do music and politics and art and all that stuff, they all get outcompeted until the entire system drops down to a more shallow state. And that's, I think, what we're perhaps seeing with social media, that you have people who are able to compete by playing the game, and the out-competing of the people who are potentially doing something more virtuous because it doesn't resonate so much on the channel actually leads to an evolution of less and less of that content.
Yeah, I think there's two ways to look at it, right? Like, because in that rat model, we're looking at a very definitive finite resource, where I think there's this, I see that in operation, I see that in action in the social media sphere based around, like, more in the fitness space. But I think that's a closed-minded view to look, because I don't think we're tapping into finite resources.
It's not a zero-sum game on social media, but people treat it like it is.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing, is realizing that, look, like, in our industry, we touch a very small part of the overall real world. We're so disconnected with that real world that we don't realize how many people don't give a shit about the little, like, crap. I'll go to places with people that in the bodybuilding community have millions of followers, and you take them to a grocery store and no one gives a fuck. And then you realize there's way more people that don't give a fuck than people that give a fuck. So it's like, yeah, that zero sum game, it's like, it can be a positive sum game in the sense that, those creatives shouldn't feel the pressure of dealing in an ecosystem of finite resources, because there are so many resources, right? So I think there's a certain level of attrition, and there's a certain level of patience for those creatives to be, that they require of them to stick to their guns to create an audience. And I think, coming back to our earlier conversation, like, I think if they saw the business sense first, they could survive without going down and sort of selling out and just becoming these very industrious, play the game sort of things. I think people resort to that because at the end of the day, the bottom line is infringed upon, and then that's going to lead them to create these decisions out of desperation.
In the middle of winter at the moment, moving on to your proper wheelhouse, which is stopping people from getting injured or fixing them if they are injured, what would you prescribe to someone this year who you think is looking to avoid injuries for 2021? What are the biggest mistakes that you see people making that cause injuries to occur?
A lot of the mistakes I think are being based off of just reintroduction to training coming out of lockdowns. So in cases where people have gone from, the ever illustrious home workout to, back into a gym setting, there's a certain level, like, of understanding that we have around training almost intuitively when it comes to overloading. Like, if I went for an off program PR or something of the like and succumb to an injury, like, a lot of people would look at that and be like, well, yeah, no shit, right? Obviously you did. But people don't see severely underloading their exercise as something that could potentially lead to injury. So I think one of the best things you could do is create a proper program in reintroducing yourself into exercise. So I think just with the state of the world, and I know with the UK, the fluctuations of lockdowns and no more lockdowns and all of that stuff, and very similar here in Canada, I think there's a certain eagerness to, like, really jump back into the fire once the gyms are open, and there's a certain, like, like, making up for lost time that kind of overwhelms people's decision making. But I think having a plan and sticking with that plan, knowing that time off it's not the major deload that you needed. You haven't been training that hard your whole life that you needed 3 months off the gym and you're just going to super compensate and just be like this. It's like, no, you're likely in a state of, I don't want to say fragility, because I think that's overstepping, but there should be a certain level of trepidation around how it is you reintroduce programming into your exercise and getting back into the gym for 2021, right? Because there's this heightened, hopefully we're all in places that are starting to open back up again. And, paired with that, the usual enthusiasm around exercise that comes with the new year and resolutions and all that. But I would put pen to paper, and I would be, I don't want to say conservative, but cognizant when it comes to your exercise programming coming into the new year.
I've always said the number one piece of advice to anybody pivoting from bro split bodybuilding into CrossFit, which was what I did, was to never go above an 8 out of 10 for the first 3 months in terms of effort. And it was just that top to 20% was where all of the injuries could occur. That was where you were going to slip a disc. That was where you were going to overextend your elbow, or that was where you were going to fucking give yourself rhabdo because you thought it was fun. And that dialing it back makes a lot of sense. What else? Are there some movement patterns that you think people need to be particularly aware of? Some common sort of lineages that you see when people get back into training?
Yeah, I mean, I always like there's two depths of resolution that I usually look at the body at. Depending on who I'm looking at, we can utilize one or two of these systems, and oftentimes they kind of superimpose. But I look at, for most people, most of the time we look at shoulder, hip, and spine, right? Like, and my biggest thing is, what is our access to full range of motion? So mobility being more an active pursuit rather than flexibility being passive. And are we loading within those limitations, right? Like if I can't put my arm over my head without weights in my hands, probably shouldn't have my arm over my head with weights in my hands. I think that's a pretty sound principle. And same thing with like, if I can't squat ass to grass with no weight on my back, probably shouldn't be getting there by means of a barbell and a bunch of plates. And then at the spine, it's a little bit different. Like, can I resist force in all three planes? So I kind of look at range of motion first, most primarily in the shoulder, because we have the greatest potential for range of motion at the shoulder, right? Like, I can't walk in like gold member and fucking put my right foot next to my ear, right? My hip's just not that mobile, right? So with the shoulder, I'm really focused on range of motion and then stability at the end, range of motion, then loading strength. With the hips, range of motion could be a limiting factor, but oftentimes we just want to get right into stability. Can you do a walking lunge? If you can't, like when we walk around all day, and like if we look at like our gait cycle, so our gait cycle is broken down into phases. One of the phases is called stance phase. Stance phase is the point in which when we're walking that we're on one leg, right? And walking is, our, other than breathing, is our most evolved adaptation that we sort of learn to do, right? You can't walk very well. You're probably not going to be able to pass on your genes historically, right? That's not the case in today's world, but there was a time where that was the case. So if we look at walking for the hips, it's like, all right, can you do like a walking lunge? If you can't spend some time in exaggerated phases of gait cycle, it's like, well, maybe a barbell back squat's probably not in your future, right? So picking out like exercises that I like to, like I've coined like gatekeeper drills. So there's a handful of exercises that I think are like mobility and stability prerequisites to loading strength. It shows proof of concept that you have adequate range of motion to get into these certain positions and have the stability or the ability to resist force at the end of these ranges of motion, which our structure limits our ability to stabilize our joints and then calls upon our muscles to do so. So, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of any gait cycle movement. Right. So, start with something like a walking lunge, start with something like a single leg RDL, start with something like a Bulgarian split squat or a rear foot elevated split squat or some sort of derivation of front foot or rear foot elevated, something that looks like how our hips function as we sort of walk around. And then the upper body, it's, try and improve your range of motion so you can get, without getting too technical, I want to see full flexion, external rotation of the glenohumeral joint with a neutral rib cage. And in the lower body, I want to be able to see these unilateral gait cycle patterns get us into a position of extension and internal rotation of the hip with a neutral pelvis. And then at the core,
what would the exercise be for overhead or for shoulder?
So it depends on where you're at. In a very remedial sense and testing stability through the overhead, a kettlebell bottom under press, I think, is one of my favorite, because a lot of times we look at the rotator cuff and we think about, creating this mass amount of rotation against resistance, but we're never really doing that when we're training, right? I'm not coming in and doing a dumbbell press and flapping my wings. The rotator cuff kind of acts like the tracks on a Smith machine. The more output we can have, you allow your prime movers, I don't necessarily like the word, but let's just call it prime movers for now, to exert force, right? So if we don't have that stability, we're not going to be able to really challenge our muscles to their potential. So something like a kettlebell bottom under, down the line, it kind of comes into like, if I'm doing pull-ups, if I'm doing dips, these are really good integrated rotator cuff exercises that train our shoulder through full flexion and full extension, and even into hyperextension with the dips. But in early stages, if we have someone who might have compromised shoulders, that might be a good place to start just with a kettlebell bottom under press, just because it's very attenuated load. You don't need to default to someone's body weight, and it just is going to highlight any limitations in range of motion at the shoulder. Like if you don't have that ability to stay flexed and externally rotated in the shoulder with a neutral rib cage, and you start to internally rotate, that kettlebell is going to fall right through your hand. right? So those are exercises. So lower body, again, just to recap, start with gait cycle movement, stationary lunge, walking lunge, single leg RDL, hip airplane. Really try and elicit a stimulus of instability through the lower body. Can you minimize your base of support and deviate your center of mass in a way that the muscles of stability around these joints of the shoulder and the hip have to now resist force? So if you have proof of concept that these muscles can resist force, you've licensed your ability to then strengthen and exert force. Right, so range of motion, mobility, or variability, however you want to look at it, stability or capacity. Do you have the capacity to hold these positions? And then that licenses you the ability to then exert strength or power. So mobility, stability, strength, variability, capacity, power. Those are kind of like it's a timing issue. It's an order of operations, if you will, of how it is you can tier movements in a way that complement the acquisition of skill of the next progression of movement.
And then the spine.
Yeah, so the spine, more specifically the lumbar spine. So the lumbar spine is where we seem to have the greatest amount of issues because we have the least amount of structural stability, right? So the lumbar spine is basically defined by, the five vertebrae beneath the thoracic spine. The thoracic spine has this, the unique structure of the rib cage that gives it a lot of stability. That's why we don't see, there's a lot of reasons why we don't see thoracic spine disc herniations as often. But one of the major reasons is we have this, think of like stepping on a pop can, right? Like if I stepped on a pop can that was fully sealed, I would have, circumferential distribution of force that would allow me at whatever, 120 kilos to stand on a sealed pop can and it not break, right? But the second there's a dent in that pop can, then it flattens, right? So if I'm looking at the whole torso from like, let's say the neck down to the tailbone or the sacrum or the pelvis, and I'm seeing, a lumbar spine that doesn't have that structural stability, and we don't have an ability to resist force internally using some of, whether it's the core four, internal obliques, external obliques, transverse abdominis, rectus abdominis, whether it's the lats, whether it's the glutes, or more internally, whether it's the multifidus or the rotatories or the erectors, deeper spinal muscles. If we don't have that lumbar spine segment as stable internally with our muscles as our thoracic spine segment is stabilized externally, let's say with our ribs, then that's a dent in the pop can, right? That's a dent in the pop can that if I'm going to apply a load to that, that's where things are going to converge, right? That's where those forces are going to converge and it potentially causes some issues. So being able to resist force through all three planes with the core. So if I think about, really common practice is the McGill Big Three, right? So the side plank, the curl up, and the bird dog. Now, this is a good starting point for someone who is detrained, someone who has a young training age, little experience in the gym, little experience with athletics. But it's not the be all end all, right? Like for a guy like you, a guy like me, a bird dog compared to a 300 kilo deadlift, a bird dog should not give you licensing, like, moral or physical licensing to be able to deadlift 300 kilos. Right? Like, what am I proving? That my spine can resist force when I'm crawling around on all fours. And I'm trying to transfer that application to when I'm standing upright with, a ton of weight in my hands. So the idea, I think, is sound. The core essence of that Big Three model is sound. Because if we think about these exercises, side plank is an anti-lateral flexion, right? Or you could look at that as like an x-axis through our body. Bird dog it's a few things, but I think at its essence compared to the other ones, it's an anti-rotation drill, right? Opposite shoulder, opposite hip. And then if we look at the curl up, it's sort of this anti-flexion extension, right? So we kind of have resistance of force through all three planes. The problem is those need to scale, right? So how is it that we can use these principles of instability, deviation of center of mass, or limitation of base support, and apply them across these three exercises to scale the intent and therefore the adaptation that we're going to derive from these exercises, right? So think of like let's go with the curl up. So a curl up would maybe go to a plank from the knees, to plank at the feet, to maybe like an ab wheel or a reverse GHR sit up or a body saw, right? And all the way up to a certain degree to a Romanian deadlift, where now we're trying to resist force through flexion extension of our spine, right? And then from a bird dog perspective, it's like a anti-rotation. I would probably start, if I was starting with someone from ground zero, I'd probably start with something like a dead bug. Dead bug is going to be a much more remedial anti-rotation drill because your spine's supported by the floor. So I would go dead bug, bird dog, maybe some sort of bear crawl, maybe some sort of supported single leg RDL, and then start to scale that all the way up to like maybe a single arm dumbbell row. Right? Now that can create a massive runway of progression through anti-rotation of the trunk. And then finally lateral flexion, right? Like side plank from the knees, and then maybe Copenhagen plank, and then unilateral carries or something like that. So through the spine, it's about being able to identify core work specific to the adaptation we're attempting to yield, and making sure we're not redundant in planes of motion that we're resisting force through, right? So a lot of people will just do core arbitrarily, and they end up having some holes, right? They do maybe 2 or 3 exercises for anti-flexion extension, and then maybe nothing for anti-rotation. Right? And then when they incorporate, maybe back squats or deadlifts, their body's going to default through the path of least resistance that they've set forth by the muscles that have been trained adequately to support their trunk. And they're always going to sort of have this weak link consequence of like, look, if you haven't trained anti-rotation, when you're loading that core axially with a deadlift or a squat, your body is going to find that path of least resistance, and it is now going to be exposed to the isolated instability through that particular range that we didn't pay attention to. So when we look at the core, it's really easy to index whether or not our core work is anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation, or anti-flexion extension. And not that any of these exercises are going to be mutually exclusive to these categories, rather suggesting small biases towards each particular plane of movement in which we're attempting to resist. So on the flip side of it, what we're trying to do is making sure that once we index these exercises, making sure in kind of this plate spinning approach, we're keeping all the balls in the air. We're keeping all the plates spinning. Right? So if I have someone who's really struggling with a bird dog, but they're rocking Copenhagen planks and they're rocking reverse GHR sit-ups, they've shown a great capacity, a great stability through anti-flexion extension or anti-lateral flexion. Yet this bird dog is still stifling them. I'm worried about how it is their body's going to organize their rib cage and pelvis when we put them through an axial load, because their deficiency is going to be in their ability to resist force through rotation. So I want to make sure I'm constantly keeping an eye on, where are we at this index? Are we making sure, are we trading at the same level of complexity, the same level of instability across all 3 layers of the trunk? And how can I progress this further and further and further? And that's really kind of the goal, is you want to, at a certain point, you want to make corrective exercise merely the pursuit of exercising correctly. Right. So I don't, we see these things in isolation. The bird dog is a deadlift warm up. It's like, look, if you need a bird dog before you deadlift, you either shouldn't be doing a bird dog or shouldn't be deadlifting. I think it's quite simple, right? Like if you are at the point where you're loading a barbell in front of your body, which is relatively inefficient from a center of mass and base support standpoint, you better make sure that dogs are barking. Right. And if you really need to wake up the muscles required to stabilize your spine with a remedial body weight quadruped offset shoulder flexion hip extension, probably shouldn't be on the barbell next. And if you are confident on the barbell, you're probably wasting your fucking time doing little bird dogs before you deadlift. So the core does become, I don't want to say a bit of a rabbit hole, but everything converges at that centerpiece of our body. So stability at the spine is in a large way a linchpin to most people's progression, whether it's peripheral at the shoulder or the hip, or whether it's even local to like compound movements. That's usually where we see the breakdown. And the breakdown is going to happen at the link that we're not paying attention to. So being able to index this way, anti-rotation, anti-lateral flexion, anti-flexion extension, and being able to make sure we're constantly progressing using exercise selection, right? And I feel so many times we progress arbitrarily through, distance, or we progress arbitrarily through load being the most common one, right? Trying to build more strength. It's like, I could do, let's say like a Superman, or so I don't know why you would, yet people still do. And I could put a plate on someone's back and be like, now it's a weighted Superman. It's like, couldn't we just come up with another exercise? Like maybe we could put up where load would matter. You know what would be a good like spinal extension exercise under load? A good morning. A good morning is an exercise we could add weight to, and that expression of strength and adding resistance to that movement is going to be beneficial, right? Where people get stuck in the exercise rather than marrying themselves to the intent of the exercise. Like, look, you're trying to improve whatever global extension or erectors or whatever. It's like, yeah, okay, if we can check off the box of the Superman drill, we have physically licensed our ability to move on to a more complex way to organize spinal extension or anti-flexion of the thoracic spine. So then using exercise progression as the most expedient means in which to create adaptation, I think is something that's widely overlooked.
Bulletproofing the body through those areas, I think would, if you could avoid injuries in the shoulder, hip, and spine, what % of injuries that you come up against do you reckon that would remove?
It's tough, right? Because it depends on the population you're going to work with. As a heuristic for most people, most of the time, I would say upwards of 80, 90%. And I use those numbers because there are 10% of people in my experience that are going to bend it until it breaks. They're the people who are not in there exercising muscles, that they're in there exercising demons. And those people, and that's why I sort of talked about two models, one of a higher resolution. That's where the biomechanical model, to me, gets a little bit more in depth. And that's when we start to encompass biomechanics around the rib cage and the pelvis. So if you're dealing with Gen Pop, weekend warriors, essentially if someone's not paying their way and putting food on their table with exercise to a certain level, like if there's not money in a bank account for them exercising, or as sport endeavor on the back end of exercising, shoulder, hip, and spine is a very expedient heuristic in which to look at human movement for the general population. That ability to index and scale based off of intent, movements of stability at the rope, from bottom under press to dip. Most people wouldn't see a correlation between bottom under press and dip because they don't understand the function of the rotator cuff. From stationary lunge to single leg RDL to B stance RDL, like most people wouldn't link those exercises together necessarily, but if you understand the intent of them, you would, right? It's from bear crawl to farmer's carry. Some people might not categorize them together, but if you have someone who's making 7 figures a year, then we might go a resolution higher and look at rib cage and pelvis. But if your athletes aren't on ESPN every night, that shoulder, hip, and spine model is a really good heuristic that allows us to see the body in a requisite resolution that will more than exceed the demands of the tasks your clients need to perform.
And would you say that looking after those areas with some of or variants of the exercises that you've given there, is that the foundation upon which everything else is built, or are there some other parts to the Bulletproof Your Body for 2021 story that we need to add?
I mean, a lot of it comes down to assessment, so you can make better choices of where the starting points are, right? Because some people, their rotator cuff intervention is going to be dips right away, right? Some people, it's going to be some sort of range of motion drill. Like if you don't have the mobility, a kettlebell bottom under press is going to be useless, right? So it's assessing. And I think that's what a lot of systems miss, is about creating effective exclusion criteria to implement expedient programming for which then you can coach from, right? Because if I just start everyone off and I have a system, well, here's my system. Everyone has to bird dog. It's like, well, fuck, man, I've been a chiropractor, personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach for 15 years. Fuck, I need a bird dog for. It's like you need to filter out a way that oh shit, okay, you don't need a bird dog. You need to do a single arm dumbbell row with 100 kilos. That's your anti-rotation through your trunk. This is how you set it up to create rotation. So I think to start off, there'd be 2 things that encapsulate maybe that shoulder, hip, and spine model. One, on the front end, would be a good intake form that allows you to write effective programming, and on the back end is the effective programming. Right? So these exercises are really kind of real-time data to give us information as to what our capacity is to resist force in these unstable positions. But preceding that should be a filtration process that allows us to pick on this scale of exercises what adaptation we think this client can actually operate at, what level of intent this client can actually operate at to make an adaptation. Right? Like I don't want to take someone who's 70 and have them do single arm dumbbell rows out of the gate, right? Maybe I start that person off with a bird dog. That's their anti-rotation. And I can only extrapolate their baseline from some sort of assessment. Right, whether it's a written history or some sort of dialogue I've had with the client. So on the front end of like really making a full working model out of this, you would want to create a detailed movement history, and then on the back end of that is you would want to create an expedient exercise program. Right, so then the idea of bulletproofing, again, not my favorite word, because I'm sure. As good of a bottom under presser as I am, a good Glock 17 would really do my shoulder in. But I think, you can't out corrective exercise bad exercise, right? So at a certain degree, we need to pay equal attention to the exercises we are performing, sure, but how we're performing these exercises, when we're performing these exercises. So no piece is more important than the other. But I think a lot of times we overlook this stability piece. We overlook this physical prerequisite model to like physically license our ability to perform these more advanced exercises. So I would say, create a good detailed assessment, whether it's a physical assessment, whether it's a historical assessment. I would argue for both being important. Go through then, your ability to express capacity or stability in these end ranges of shoulder, hip, and spine, and then go from there into programming and proper execution.
What about if someone doesn't have access to a chiropractor and they just got to self-regulate with this stuff?
Yeah, great. I mean, probably better off that way, honestly, the way most chiropractors work. If I'm being, I can talk shit because I am one, and I know the standard's not great. Yeah, it's everything is on the internet, and it's to what degree it's expedient for you or cost effective for you to go and find it, because there are, obviously there is tangible subdivisions of that heuristic that you look at the shoulder through a particular lens, you look at the hip through a particular lens. There's a way to create your own internal system of checks and balances. It's just a matter of how much you want to put into it, right? And that's why most people go pay a chiropractor, because they're hoping being the operative word, that on the other end of it, they're going to have a, some sort of home exercise, some sort of action plan. That's often not the case, and if it is, it's usually little stick figure drawings of remedial exercises that they've printed off since grad school, and they've been photocopying 100 times a month and until you get your hands on one. So it is difficult to kind of sift through the noise to find signal, but it's definitely out there. But I would say the biggest thing is just to start, right? And if you can control your variables, you can start to accurately assess for the validity of your implementation. Right. If you change everything, it's like, well, this whole equation's upside down now. So I don't know what of these things is actually giving me a positive return. So just being very methodical, being very reproducible, like, okay, I'm going to do this for my shoulder warm up and see what it does. I'm going to do this for my hip warm up or workout and see what it does. And then that'll allow you over time to distill down to something that is very effective. So, intuitive athletes do this really well. And when you look at it from a scientific perspective or a biomechanical perspective, like, wow, like, this guy doesn't know the difference between a serratus anterior and a knee, but in what he does to prepare is very congruent with, biomechanics, and he's organizing his body in a way to activate these muscles or to deactivate other muscles or what have you. But if you don't have that intuition, it can be learned. Right. It's just a matter of, what is it worth to you to spend the time to learn it?
Looking forward to 2021, what are you going to be working on personally? Have you got some areas that you're looking to develop or restrict within yourself over the next year?
Like, are you talking my own personal training or just from a business perspective?
From a business and mindset perspective, more so.
Yeah. Really working on like optimization around my schedule. So kind of working with someone right now to try and get the most out of me from a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month. I'm very much a keep your head down and go until you can't. And if you run into a wall, just run through it. And that has got me pretty far, but it's not really a sustainable or efficient model. So definitely looking at a few scheduled work deloads to stay topical to the conversation. And then on the business front, a lot of curriculum development, a lot of writing. I've started a handful of other businesses that are in various stages of like pre-production or programming or things like that. So I have 3 companies now that I'm in, have sort of taken some level of ownership of. So a lot of next year is going to be kind of moving into uncharted territories on the business end. Everything from some technology stuff, some administrative stuff, some advising stuff, and then sticking with creating curriculum and developing a handful of new courses for Prescript. So 2021 is pretty much already done, in my opinion. So looking forward now into 2022. It should be a busy year, and hopefully, with any luck, be able to get to your side of the pond as soon as possible.
Yeah, man. Well, I'd wait until it warms up a little bit because it's absolutely freezing at the moment. You had a post on your Instagram that I think relates to what you were just talking about. You said, if you love something, let it kill you. And I think this talks about the feet first approach to outcompeting people, first through workload, but also that embracing your passion fully and taking an essentialist perspective actually allows us to really sort of feel the nuances of everything we do. It also gives you a competitive advantage and other things. But as you've just identified there, it's not sustainable. So how do you balance those two things?
Strategically. I think that's something that if you know, like think of training, right? Like you need to have, I'm not one for scheduled deloads, right? So like to kind of speak more my language, like I will train until I see indications that I need to deload my training. And so that's why I see metrics as something that's very important, whether it's tracking heart rate variability, whether it's tracking bar speed or grip strength or velocity or whatever. I need to have data to tell me to slow down. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. And I think as you should, right? Because I think a lot of times if you just succumb to these arbitrary regressions of intensity, you're actually going to be missing your potential long term. So I see that in training, and I've seen the benefit of like, okay, I see indicators that fatigue is now a detriment to the progress in training. I am going to do something to offset this fatigue and be able to perform better. Then that's when a period of detraining would ensue, rather than just, oh, I've been training hard for 3 weeks. I'm going to cut my volume back 30%, cut my intensity back 30%. It's like, man, what if that was the exact point in which you should have showed up and you should have turned up? So in business, it's really similar, where it's like, I can sit on my laptop for days on end and not blink. But if I start to notice at the end of a week, I'm yielding less and I'm seeing less progress, and I have these indicators that would suggest to me that, okay, I need to slow down in order to actually go forward. So that for me is just having good data, good metrics to track productivity, whether that's number of words I type in a day versus number of words I type in a week, and tracking and setting deadlines and creating urgency. So for me, it's really just been a process of like, okay, I'm at a point now where the metrics are telling me that in order to move forward, I need to slow down, and slow down strategically. Like I'm not just going to F off and, just do some morning meditation crap. It's like, no, like I'm going to still get up and work efficiently and expediently. But at the end of, let's say once I get this one project, when I finish writing the book, then I'm going to take 10 days and I'm out. Right. So I kind of have like a little bit of a push, a little bit of a push to get the work done. And then at the end of it, I get a bit of a reward and I get to kind of deload a bit after that. Well, once I've kind of, gone through, similar to a competition, it's like, okay, if I pull a PR at a meet, I'm going to take, a week or two off the back end before I'm, back really on the barbell. It's the same thing with this. It's like before I really, in order for me to really sink my teeth into the next project, I know I can't just go from a max effort getting this book through publication, get it through edit, get it to print, and get it through distribution, to then turn around and I'm not going to be 100% to the project I have planned after that. So that's going to be like, all right, time to take off, shut down, and then come back and start to plan again. So it's not easy for me. Like I was always, because I've gotten whatever this is for our ability to, I don't know, what do we do? Like, what is this? This is work for us. Somehow we've hacked a system that it's a glitch.
It's a glitch in the matrix, man.
It is, yeah. Because I'm wearing sweatpants and I'm technically employed. Like, this is not okay. But like, because I've gotten here by just pure grunt work. Like, sure. Oh, how do you do this? Well, if you go on a plane and you travel around the world for 3 years and you live out of a suitcase and you trash every relationship you've ever had and you just say yes to every opportunity, you'll be able to do this. So I was like, yeah, great, done that. Now it's like, okay, how do I get to the next level? It's like, well, now you need to slow down. You're like, I don't know what that means. So it is difficult to have the discipline now to, just like in training, like, there are times when I train 4 days a week. And it drives me nuts because it's 3 days of me a week to me climbing the fucking walls. But it's like, I know that if I want to get bigger, if I want to get stronger, I have to only train 4 days a week in this period. So I'm at the point now where it's like, all right, from like a lifestyle perspective, to overcome this plateau, I need to express the discipline enough to remove myself from that attitude of like, just keep your head down, don't blink, take a bunch of drugs, and then just work until you can't work anymore, then work some more. So that's something that's frankly taken more wrestling with mentally than anything else I've ever done, because of you're telling me to not do something. But it's recognizing that that's what it takes to get what you want and get to where you need to be or where you want to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a lot more nuanced, right? It's very easy to just say, go all out. For all that I'm very, very impressed with powerlifters and what those athletes can achieve, it's not a very subtle sport. It's applied the maximum amount of power through the bar at all times when you're on the competition floor. That's it, And that, I think, perhaps ports across onto the way that people sometimes think that they should live their lives. Like, we're absolutist creatures, If I put a packet of biscuits in front of you and I say, you can eat none of them or you can eat all of them, both of those things are quite easy. But if you're only allowed to eat one biscuit, it's fucking torture. You're like, no, I can't do the middle. I'm not good with moderation. I'm either no carbs or all carbs. That's the way that we seem to be able to do things, because it removes the decision, the requirement for decision, removes the requirement for subtlety.
To me, there's no such thing as dedication and moderation. That doesn't make sense to me. Like, how can those two things go? How can you be dedicated to something and still be moderate and still be balanced? So like, this is more of an approach of like extreme balance, where it's like, I will work as hard as I can for as long as I can.
That sounds like a semantic game that you've played to sort of repurpose this into your particular sort of cognitive makeup.
Yeah, and these are the mental gymnastics I have to play with myself to get me to stop just like burning the candle on both ends. But yeah, like when I go to, I don't know, I'm trying to find COVID-free quarantine destinations that at the end of February I could just leave to. So wherever that place is that I go when I'm finished, the book, for example, there will be a period. I don't know how brief it'll be, but there will be a day or two where I don't open my laptop, I'm sure. I'm probably not going to go the whole 10 days that I have allotted without doing it, but I will deload my brain until what degree I feel it's necessary, and then right back into the fire again.
Croatia, Dubai, Bali, 3 relatively open places.
Brilliant. I'll go to all 3.
Perfect. What's the book about? Finish up. Tell us about the book.
Yeah, so the book is something that I've been writing in accordance with kind of our flagship course. So I've developed a handful of courses for some gym franchises kind of all over. So Brits would be familiar with Ultimate Performance, and the Canadians would be familiar with Good Life Fitness. So I was contracted many years ago to revamp the personal training education in both of those companies, and from there sort of garnered a lot of interest in social media to be sort of taught similar principles that I was teaching there, obviously in a private setting. So I kind of created this like 4-month, 16-week course that I think would be, okay, if I were to be a personal trainer starting out, synthesizing my 15 years as a chiropractor, a strength conditioning coach, and a personal trainer, and a strength athlete to various degree. What do I think is essential for people to know from like anatomy and applied biomechanics standpoint? So the book is essentially a manual for that course. So it's I don't know, the better part of 50, 60,000 words now, and we're soon across the line and in the design stage and all that stuff and editing. But yeah, so it is a complement to go with the Prescript Level 1 curriculum that basically is going to act as an expanded version of the course and a reference text for that particular course. And yeah, it's been somewhat of the book predates the actual development of the course itself. So this has been probably through 4 or 5 years in the making now. So excited to get it across the line.
That's cool, man. And when's it out?
End of March. So I said it. Now it has to be true. So yeah, end of March should be when the next semester goes live. The students for next semester will have access to purchase the hard copy of the book, and then all previous coaches who have gone through the course in the last couple of years will have access to it as well.
That is a unique approach. I haven't seen, from the outside looking in, I'm aware that I'm a total noob with this. I haven't really seen the training for PTs, at least in the UK, really seem to take much development. And you see the sort of top-end strength and conditioning stuff has really changed, but the entry level for someone to be able to step out onto the gym floor, it's just get your level 3, I think it's PT level 3 in the UK, and you walk into any CrossFit gym, and even the noob coaches know more than that. Even the people that are just practicing for the level 1, and then I imagine that you can take that one step further and one step further and one step further.
Yeah, I think just given the current landscape, man, like there's no room in the market now for mediocrity. I think personal training now is really going to return back to a luxury item, which it was 20 years ago, right? Only the rich and famous had personal trainers 25 years ago, right? Because it was deemed a luxury. Not that I think they had an amazing skill set then, but I think now that the consumer is getting smarter, the access of information, the barriers to that information are less and less at the consumer level. You're really going to have to bring a supreme product as a trainer to the table if you want to continue to do that as a career. Where before it was like, I always compare personal training akin to stripping. I know plenty of people that just personal trained their way through undergrad, just like I know plenty of people who just stripped their way through undergrad. It's like that market is not going to be there anymore. With commercial gym franchises taking a hit, with people's budgets not necessarily calling for them and to have this disposable income for a luxury service like that, and people's like unwillingness to return back into public facilities and open gym spaces. I think there's really going to be a high ticket value placed on someone like, look, if I'm going to jump through all of these hoops to be in person and take an hour of my time and have a personal trainer, this person better be able to, drastically improve my quality of life across many indices, right? So not only is it just body composition and transformation, but it is going to be pain and performance as well. So I think there is going to be somewhat of an enlightenment in the personal training field, and raising the standard of just the barrier of entry to people into that field is definitely something that we're kind of committed to. With the education that we put out. And so we're not in the interest of dumbing things down. We ask our coaches to sort of smarten up, and then collectively, I think we're hopefully starting to raise the industry standard as a consequence of that.
I hope so, man. I do fear for PTs that haven't decided to do their CPD and take that really seriously, because you're not just competing with other PTs now. You're competing with CrossFit classes and BJJ classes and yoga classes and Peloton and Zoom workouts and all this sort of stuff. So as the leverage and the scalability of that has increased, the level that you need to be at in order to be able to compete with that as a PT, I think, is correct. And that's a message I've been saying for ages to every PT that I know. I'm like, dude, you need to be shit hot with your branding. You need to understand how to market. You need to understand how to retain clients. Your pricing strategy needs to be clever. You need to understand how to do a schedule. You also need to make sure that your actual knowledge of what you're doing hasn't stagnated from when you first became a PT 7 years ago. Shit's changed.
Right.
There's new studies being released every single week. And I think, especially because a lot of PTs get busy, right? Like, especially when you've become well known and you've got a name for yourself. PTs can become really, really busy. My old housemate, Lou, was doing like 50 hours a week of one-to-ones. That's a fucking ton of one-to-ones. Now, he used to take time off, and he was like deep into loving fitness. So he was always reading something. He'd be reading some magazine in between his sessions and stuff. I was thinking, man, like 50 hours a week of one-to-one must be absolutely fucking exhausting. So yeah, it's good, man. I hope that does make people turn a corner in the PT world. I really hope it does.
Yeah, and we're not the only ones out there doing it. I think there's a lot of really good educators that are attempting to raise the standard. So I think because there's a market now for decentralized education. There's now a vetting process of educators and who's really willing to bring a product to market that is not just furthering the noise and entering more into the repository of useless knowledge. That can you leave an hour Zoom call or an hour lab session or an hour lecture and that immediately affect the way you train the next day. So that's really kind of where we're pushing. We're pushing the education is for immediate application. Obviously, with the limitations and hands-on, we're getting a little bit more clever with the way we're delivering courses and interacting with our students, so they can have that dramatic effect. They can get the return on the investment immediately, and we're not just floating ideas in their head for them to write clever captions on Instagram.
Yeah, I hope so, man. People want to check out what you do or more about yourself, where should they go?
So Instagram is probably the best way to find me, just as on the internet. So it's at @the_muscle_doc. A little bit of a deeper dive would find you in our podcast, which is RXD Radio on Spotify, iTunes, and all that stuff. And then if you're interested in the education side of things, That would be www.pre-script.com. So that's where we run all our education through. So we have 4 courses at the moment, and that library will be expanding to 7 by the time we hit 2022. So I said we were working into 2022. I wasn't lying.
7 plus a book by the end of March.
It'll be 5 plus a book, and then the end of the year will be 7 plus 3 books, and then the end of 2022 into 2023 will be 7 and 7 books.
Shit the bed. Shit the bed. Busy year ahead.
Yes.
Jordan, man, thank you for your time.
Pleasure, man. Thanks so much for putting up with the technical difficulties and all that. And hopefully the quality of the production matches the quality of the conversation.
Beautiful, man. HD beard.